Hi, everyone. In this video, I want to talk about Nietzsche's theory of the drives. Although Nietzsche made a lot of contributions to drive psychology over the course of his entire life, his clearest account of the drives, of how they interact with one another, and of the dynamics by which they grow and eventually wither away is laid out in Daybreak from 1881. So I'll be focusing my explanation on that text. Now, Nietzsche begins by explaining that most of us have a misunderstanding of who we are, or rather, an incomplete image of ourselves, because we don't really appreciate the extent to which our drives are the ultimate engines of our behavior. We don't realize how many drives we have, how strong they are, and the extent to which the typical narrative that we tell ourselves about our own behavior, namely that it's based on our free will, is itself a kind of fable or an illusion that we use to cover over the uncomfortable reality or the uncomfortable fact that our behavior is guided by these animalistic, organic impulses or drives over which we have no control. According to Nietzsche, humans, because we are animals, are full of drives. He says there is a drive to combativeness, there is a drive for fame, there is a drive for power, there is a drive for food, that's what we call hunger, a drive for satiating thirst, so on and so forth. And all these drives are subject to a principle that I call the principle of asymmetrical nutrition. And essentially, it means that Nietzsche understands each individual drive as a fundamentally voracious or appetitive, hungry little creature that is constantly trying to get its object of desire. And we cannot feed all the drives equally. So there is always going to be an imbalance between which drives are being fed at any particular moment and which aren't. And that introduces an asynchrony or an imbalance because it means that as I feed a particular drive, that drive is going to grow the more that it is fed. But as one particular drive grows, the other ones start withering away until I feed those drives, and then those grow, and the other drive starts itself withering away. So there is here a kind of zero sum game where I cannot feed all the drives at the same time or to the same extent. And so they are in a perpetual state of essentially civil war between themselves. But if the drives are hungry impulses that demand satisfaction, how exactly are they fed? Nietzsche is very clear that the feeding of the drives is not something that we do consciously or intentionally. In other words, it's not as if I wake up in the morning and I decide, today I'm going to cultivate my drive for fame, but tomorrow I'm going to cultivate my drive for water or my drive for food. Rather, the drives get fed by chance, by pure circumstance. So I can be walking around one day and I experience certain events that trigger certain drives to start getting activated and to start making movements to be fed more and more and more. And all of this happens below the threshold of conscious perception. So imagine, this is my own example, that I'm walking around one day and there's a very, very loud noise in the background. That noise might start getting annoying and it might start feeding, without my knowledge, my drive for revenge or for combativeness. And so, if a few minutes later I meet a friend and my friend says something that I don't particularly like, I will already be primed in some way to start a fight with my friend because my drive for combativeness and for aggressiveness has already been fed for me by the nature of the world, by circumstance, by whatever happened in my environment. Although all the drives are similar in that they are voracious and competitive with one another because they're constantly battling for energy and for nutrition, Nietzsche makes the claim that they differ in important regards. He says there are some drives that require to be fed by the real thing that they desire. But then there are some drives that you can fool into thinking that you fed them even when you really haven't. So let me give you a clear example of this. In the first category of drives that you cannot fool, you have something like hunger. Nietzsche says, when you're hungry, there is no way to satiate the stomach except by eating. The body demands real food, and it doesn't matter what you do until it gets real food, it's not going to stop drawing attention to itself. But then there are other drives. So think about our desire for fame, or our drive for sex, or our drive for power. Nietzsche says sometimes you can feed those drives imaginary food in the form of fantasies and illusions and hallucinations, and that will quiet them down because they think that they've been fed, even though in reality they haven't. And according to Nietzsche, the clearest example of this phantasmagoric feeding of the drives is in dreams. When I dream, what I'm essentially doing is I'm playing all these scenarios in my mind's eye that satisfy certain drives that I carry with me. And so in dreams, those desires are getting discharged, those drives are being satisfied without me actually having to be famous, or without me actually having to get into a real battle to satisfy my drive for honor and courage and recognition. According to Nietzsche, the drives are the real engines of human behavior. So, why did I do a particular thing rather than another? It's not because of free will, and it is not because I desire to do that thing in a particular moment after careful consideration and rational reflection. It's simply because at that particular moment in time, a particular drive was dominant in my interior life, and it pushed me in that direction. So there is a very clear causal determinism that Nietzsche associates with the drives. And he argues that when we think that there are psychological causes for our behavior, like intentions, desires, beliefs, thoughts, that's already a misunderstanding of the underlying reality, which is that the true reason lies at the domain or at the level of physiology. It's because a particular biological, organic, blind drive that is not subject to rational control happened to push me in that direction and nudged me to do the thing that I ended up doing. And so Nietzsche does contribute to drive psychology by encouraging psychology to get out of the rational dimension of human experience and recognize that there are these animalistic impulses that move us and that are the real explanations for our behavior. Now, Nietzsche's remarks about the drives do raise an interesting question. Are we simply passive in the face of our drives, which determine our behavior independently of our control? Or are there things that we can do to exercise some kind of agency in relation to the drives that we carry in our breast? At various times, Nietzsche vacillates on this question. Sometimes he says that we have no control over the drives because not only do we not know what those drives are, but the drives might be unknowable in some cases. So there might be a limit to the kind of cognitive access that we have to the drives that move us. At times, however, he does say that we can exercise a form of indirect control over the drives. And he uses the metaphor of a gardener. So think about the drives as plants that grow in different directions depending on what they desire. And think about us as gardeners who can choose what to do with these plants. We can leave them alone and let them do their own thing and just enjoy the ride of existence, letting the particular drive that happens to be powerful at this particular moment take over my mental life and my behavior. Or I can try to cultivate my drives in particular ways. I can water some, not water others. This is where Nietzsche comes close to being a virtue ethicist, because he does believe that through practice and through habituation, we can give nutrition to some drives to ensure that they grow, and let other ones disappear through a lack of use. Although he says that neither of these options is better than the other. So it's not as if you ought to cultivate the garden, and it's not as if you ought to let the drives run wild. This is where his existentialist inclination comes to the foreground, because Nietzsche says you are at liberty to do either one of those, and you need to embrace that freedom.